Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome to our October book club episode. This month we've been reading the latest novel from Marieke Bigg, A Scarab Where the Heart Should Be, which is out now and published by Dead Ink Books. Marieke Bigg is an author of fiction and non-fiction based in London. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge, where she studied the technological transformation of human reproduction. Her debut non-fiction book, This Won't Hurt: How Medicine Fails Women, was published last year and was described as groundbreaking and a must-read. Her debut novel, Waiting for Ted, was published in 2022, also by Dead Ink Books, and as well as all of this, Marieke is also a trainee psychotherapist, runs writing workshops, lectures, and collaborates with scientists and artists to produce exhibitions that conjure new social worlds. Here to chat all about her second novel, welcome Marieke to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for coming on. I'm very excited to chat to you. But before we get into your book, I have to ask my favourite question, which is, what are you currently reading?
I'm reading a classic at the moment. I'm reading One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. It's actually sort of part of my research for my next project. So
Oh my goodness, how exciting. Is your next project, is this fiction or you're not allowed to say?
well, there's going to be non-fiction in between, but
Ooh.
I'm working on fiction now. Yeah.
How exciting. I also had another author on the podcast recommend that book wholeheartedly. I think it was Leo Vodiashvili who, oh my gosh, his book has just gone out of my head. Good grief, that's terrible. Hard by a Great Forest, that's what it is. So his book was fantastic, and he said one of his biggest influences was that book. So I actually haven't read that one yet. Are you quite good at reading classics? Like, have you got through quite a few?
I mean, I don't know. Probably it's so relative, isn't it? I think, yeah, I've read like my fair share, but after I graduated from university, I really enjoyed reading whatever I felt like reading. And
Fair.
that was a lot of, contemporary stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of go back and forth a bit, I'd say.
I try to read classics here and there, but I wouldn't say I'm great at getting to them. I think I've got a bit of a complex about them because I just have this thing sometimes where I feel like the most unintelligent person on the planet. I don't know if it's like a northern working class thing, and because I'm so into books, and the second somebody's like, "Oh, have you read this?" and I haven't, I feel instantly like guilty for the fact that I've not read that, but I've read like loads of contemporary stuff. I just think it's so funny the way like not having got to classics makes you feel.
Yeah, no, it's hard. I mean, reading and writing generally is so shrouded in this kind of elitism that really sucks the joy out of it. I
Yeah.
completely agree.
Now, I want to ask you how you got into writing novels, because I feel like with your career path, like it's quite kind of likely that you would have written non-fiction, but
Mhm.
novels, where did that kind of come from?
Yeah, I think fiction was what I always actually wanted to do at some level. And when I finished my undergrad, I knew I wanted to sort of spend time writing fiction, but I also had to sort of pay the bills and think about what was sort of sensible, quote
Yeah.
unquote. So I was sort of exploring different options for a while, and then I found this call for proposals for research at the British Library, because they had all of these archives of different scientists, and they wanted, people to kind of work on them. So I wrote this proposal based on one of those archives of this scientist. She was this IVF pioneer, born in the late 1920s, had this really amazing life working as an embryologist, also developing IVF, ended up working with NASA, all of these
Oh my
amazing things.
gosh.
And I just thought, oh, this is a really great story and one I'd like to tell. And doing, a research project would be a kind of way to facilitate that. So then I ended up doing a PhD at Cambridge, looking at this woman's life and her contributions to IVF. So that was sort of how it started. So I think academia was always my way of trying to sort of facilitate the storytelling. And then when I finished my PhD, I kind of found an agent, wrote a book proposal for a nonfiction book. And then once I had my agent, I just thought, you know what, let's just give fiction some real time. And I have this avenue now. So I wrote Waiting for Ted, and I shared it with my agent, and then that, set me on that path. So it's all been, I think it was always headed in that direction, but I see how you're from the outside. That's not really obvious.
No, I love that so much. And that's such a great story to be able to tell rather than just being like, yeah, I just fancied writing a book.
Yeah.
I speak to a lot of debut authors, and they obviously talk about like their journey with writing their debut novel and having that put out into the world and what that kind of feels like. But I know for a lot of authors, writing the second novel can sometimes be scarier because there's kind of a pressure that if people have enjoyed your first book, how are they going to feel about your second book? Did you experience that?
I think in a way my journey's been maybe a bit different because I was sort of learning kind of by doing, I hadn't done any, extensive formal creative writing training or anything. So Waiting for Ted was sort of my first kind of dedicated attempt. And, I was happy that it was out there, but it's always felt like this kind of learning process to me. So it gave me a bit of confidence because I thought, oh, this is actually something I can do and people enjoy reading. And it just sort of, gave me a bit of a boost. And then I did the second book more confidently, I'd say.
Yeah, I love that. Let's get into your book then. So obviously our October book club episodes, we encourage people to kind of read at their own pace, and then hopefully they're listening to this once they've read it. But for listeners that are new to the podcast and haven't actually got around to your book yet, how would you kind of summarize A Scarab Where the Heart Should Be?
Well, it's about an obsessive architect called Jackie Mackenzie who gets dubbed the Beetle as the story unfolds, partly because of her appearance, but also her demeanor, which is just a bit sort of insect-like and cold and very kind of guarded. And she kind of leans into that and starts dressing like one and behaving like one increasingly as the story unfolds. And it's kind of a story of her trying to, kind of her obsessiveness as an architect, trying to streamline her entire life according to her vision. And in doing that, she, jeopardizes her relationships. She has a relationship with a man who she also works with, and also a woman who she goes to when she's feeling vulnerable. And it's kind of the story of her very painfully trying to find love, really.
I love that. I really enjoyed this book, and it has this kind of real surreal quality to it at times. What do you think inspired that writing style for you?
I don't know. I think part of that was sort of channeling this character, and she's very tragic in some ways, but she's also got this, love for architecture and aesthetics. And it was sort of trying to capture the sort of magic of that, but at the same time, it's complete sort of its seductiveness, but also its unreality. It's sort of a place she goes to escape her feelings, her, her life. So I think that's really where that kind of magical kind of style came from.
Let's zone in on Jackie, because I feel like she's such a fascinating character, and there's clearly a disconnect between how she believes herself to be and how the world actually perceives her. And early in the book, you write, she had a way of irritating people. They called it arrogance, but what they were talking about was passion, her devotion to patterns over people. And I just love that kind of summary of a person, because I just think it's so fascinating. How did she first arrive to you?
Yeah, I started off thinking, for some reason, I misread a line in a book, and I thought it said she didn't hear him say it was over. So it was sort of this scenario I had in my head where someone's trying to break up with you, but you're so engrossed in your own stuff that you can't hear them. And that just got me thinking, what kind of personality, like where would someone need to be at to be that way? And Jackie kind of flowed from that scenario.
Yeah,
And got
absolutely.
increasingly like extreme and unhinged.
I love that. And she does kind of slot into this. We've seen this new wave in contemporary fiction in the last, like, I don't know, maybe 5 years, maybe 5 to 10 years, but I wouldn't, maybe not as far as 10 years. But we've seen this kind of wave of like unlikable female protagonists. What are your kind of feelings around that? Like, do you feel like she slots into that? Do you not believe in unlikable female protagonists? Like, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, that's definitely not something I'm thinking when I'm
Yeah.
writing. I guess I'm just I write characters that I'm interested in.
Hmm.
And I've recently sort of started to see that I think I'm interested in characters who kind of don't quite present themselves authentically or
Mm.
don't really say what they mean, so
Yeah.
they have this whole inner world that's just really kind of desynchronous with the way they present to the world. And I
Hmm.
think that's what really fascinates me. And yeah, I mean, this whole unlikable character thing, I can't help but feel there's a kind of sexist dimension
Oh
to that.
yeah.
Because when do we really, we talk about male anti-heroes, but we don't really, when do we use that to describe a male character? So I don't think about characters in that way. I have sympathy for the characters I write, even when I see that their behaviors are profoundly unhelpful and hurt people, but that's just being a human.
Yeah, and I think, that kind of conversation with gender is definitely in this book with the fact that she's so kind of obsessive in her line of work. And obviously, there are multiple things that will be why she's so obsessive with her work. But for men that are obsessive with their work, it's like, oh, they're driven, they're so ambitious. But for
Exactly.
her, it's a totally different kind of thing, the way that she's perceived in that way, which I
Yeah.
found really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something I was sort of thinking about as I was writing, just this kind of myth of the creative genius and
Hmm.
how we accept that when it comes to men, but for women, that's just not only, not socially acceptable, but also really hard to maintain as a
Yeah.
woman, just in light of other, desires, responsibilities. I explore Jackie, considering freezing her eggs for
Yeah.
part of the book, like another way to sort of immortalize herself. But yeah, it's just I was really thinking about, yeah, this sort of myth of genius and obsession when it comes to women. Yeah.
But let's talk about her line of work, because she's an architect and she's referenced at times as a starchitect, which is that just like a famous architect? Is that what that means?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
What interested you in writing about that line of work?
I think I've always been interested in architecture just because I think I'm quite visual. So it's just, I find it a really kind of just, yeah, stimulating way of
Mm,
kind of thinking about concepts. And I really thought it also suited Jackie to be an architect just because it is this way of kind of imposing your vision on an environment and on others. It's
yeah.
very kind of uncompromising. So yeah, I think it was just those two things that really made it feel like that had to be her, her obsession.
Yeah, completely. And you mentioned before Mark and Clarissa, who are Jackie's romantic partners in the book. What did you feel that their dynamic kind of represents about modern relationships, or even about Jackie herself?
Yeah, I think for Jackie, it's kind of about, I talk in the book about it being a sort of structure between the three of them, and they each have their role to play in keeping the structure intact. And for Jackie, it's a kind of support structure that allows her not to take responsibility for herself, basically. She's got people to blame, but also Clarissa, this woman to go to when she really needs emotional support because the life she's built based on, streamlining and cutting away emotions and feeling doesn't work. So
Mm,
she's got this kind of, this kind of, yeah, structure that really holds it in place for her. And then Mark and Clarissa have their own, reasons. Mark benefits from her kind of creativity and it helps him kind of move through his career. And Clarissa feels good helping people. That's a familiar kind of dynamic for her. I think for Jackie, it made a lot of sense to have this kind of mutually sustaining kind of structure around her.
yeah, for sure. I obviously said in my intro that you're training to be a psychotherapist, and I don't know how long you've been doing this for, but I do feel like you would have a field day with somebody like Jackie.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I'm discovering more and more just the kind of similarities in the process of writing and in therapy. It feels similar in that you're trying to kind of understand and empathize with someone, and to really inhabit their worldview. So yeah, it's really, I find it a very creative, but also, yeah, I find a lot of sympathy for my characters that way.
And how do you go about like creating your characters? Like, what are you thinking about when you're, kind of populating your novels? Like,
Mhm.
what are you thinking about?
That's such an yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, it's a lot about just really getting kind of under the skin of a character and
Hmm.
understanding, what their vulnerabilities are,
Yeah.
really, their pain, because I feel like we're driven, I think, mainly by fear and shame.
Oh, absolutely.
I think these are the main drivers. So once I kind of understand that about someone, I can understand how they might react to certain situations where they want to move, yeah, and also what an interesting interaction would be, who else needs to be there to kind of draw them out.
Yeah, I got this quite cold and kind of detached sense from Jackie in certain aspects of the book. And I know that some people might interpret that one way, but to me, it's like that's a kind of form of self-protection. And one of the things that you explore in the book is cancel culture.
Mm.
And Jackie says some quite questionable things and posts them online. I think it's on Twitter that she posts them, but it's kind of unclear whether she's actually concerned with being cancelled, quote unquote.
Mhm.
What interests you about cancel culture, and are there any kind of particular instances of cancel culture that you've been struck by and were like, I want to write about that?
Yeah, I think again, from Jackie's perspective, there is this kind of mismatch between her inner world and how she presents herself. And I
Yeah.
think that's what I find interesting. It's like she's deeply vulnerable. She has this need to be loved, but she presents herself in this very guarded, very kind of aggressive,
Hmm.
opinionated way. And, I think also just with the kind of politics around, identity culture and things, I think that's what I find quite interesting. Just, I think generally people could benefit from doing more, therapeutic work and kind of finding this like self-awareness, because I
Yeah.
think a lot of like personal traumas are kind of aired on social media and through
Mm,
politics. And yeah, I think a lot of people don't sort of distinguish between their beliefs and their kind of reactive kind of feelings that
yeah.
often stem from, pain and experiences they've had. So yeah, I think that's what I kind of was playing with Jackie,
Hmm.
just putting her in this kind of arena of like a very cold, brutal kind of arena where she's almost kind of screaming into a void on Twitter, and she's terrified of what will come back, but at the same time she wants to scream, she wants to express herself.
And I was interested in the differences between what Mark and what Clarissa mean to her, and their kind of place in her life, or rather their role in her life. And it feels like she kind of turns up on Clarissa's doorstep every time she's feeling particularly vulnerable or she's needing some kind of comfort. Were you seeing Clarissa as this sort of comfort or kind of maternal figure to Jackie?
Yeah, I think I definitely saw her. I think I saw her more as the person she goes to when she's feeling more honest,
Yeah.
when she's kind of broken down and more vulnerable. She goes to Clarissa, and they have this kind of very real, very close, warm love between them.
Hmm.
And Clarissa has her own, complexes and her own reasons for wanting to be that kind of protective presence in her life.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's sort of this other kind of pole to Jackie's, and she keeps gravitating back and more as the story goes on, as she's sort of broken down by the things that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, between each chapter are these mini sections where you write about like various beetles.
Mhm.
What, where does this fascination with beetles come from?
Hmm.
And what drew you to writing about them?
I think it's something that just sort of flowed from Jackie's character, but
Yeah.
just as I started to explore, how I started to see her more as this beetle-like character and had people referring her in that way, and then having her kind of lean into this identity as a kind of shield. She's just sort of appropriating it so that people can't hurt her with it. And she gets lost in that. that sort of, yeah, that kind of self-righteousness, and gets more and more obsessive. And I just thought, let's have her, get, really into Beatles and studying them, and yeah, and just really kind of losing herself through that.
But what do you think are the kind of links between her and Beatles? Like, I know you were saying before about her being like quite insect-like, but why specifically Beatles?
I mean, I think I just like them as a kind of creature. I mean,
Yeah.
sort of this like bug-like kind of cagey, you've got the sort of shielded wings and the big kind of eyes sort of peering out. Beetles have this sort of, they evoke a kind of repulsion. We feel kind of like they're a bit, yeah, gross. We want to keep them at bay.
Yeah.
I think that's something that Jackie feels very strongly. She's internalized this sort of self-hate. She sees herself as an outsider, and people see her that way too. So I
Yeah.
think in that sense, it kind of, that creatureliness kind of worked for her.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about the ending. Now, I try and be really careful about spoilers in these episodes because some people might not have read the book, but I'm hoping people have. But the building that or this space that she's created in the end of the book, at the end of the book, she's in this quite odd state, and, she reveals herself to the journalists, and it's almost like, I want to say like womb-like, and she kind of comes out of it at the end, and she's very vulnerable, and she's in this kind of strange state where, a lot has happened. I'm trying to be careful of spoilers, so it's hard to
Yeah.
word it, but yeah, she's in this like odd state. So why was it important to you for the character to kind of round off her journey in this way?
I mean, yeah, I think it's this like sort of tension in Jackie's character where there's sort of aspects of what she's trying to do that are very hopeful. As a woman, she's trying to kind of change the way we think about architecture and its relationship, and sort of our relationship as humans to the world. And she's kind of trying to create these spaces or ways of doing things that are more accommodating to her, that kind of allow her to be free and express herself. And this structure she creates is a kind of another desperate attempt to kind of be reborn and
Yeah.
to create this kind of living organism made of kind of skin around her that is really womb-like. Yeah. And she kind of crawls out, and she wants so desperately to be reborn and to just live in a world that kind of accepts her. But it's quite tragic because she's going about it the wrong way.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there any sort of particular images that you had in mind when you were creating this space that Jackie's made?
I think the thing that was most sort of visually sort of alive for me was the skin itself that she
Yeah.
was creating. Just kind of, it's kind of slightly translucent, sort of jellyfish-like kind of glow. I think that's what I was really, yeah, focusing on, and how she was making the skin herself, and just what a kind of freaky substance that is to be kind of working with.
It's so good. I love that. So, for our listeners that haven't already read this book, I'm going to pop a link in the show notes to go and order yourselves a copy. Please go and grab it if you haven't already. And if you have already read the book, please come and chat to us about it. Before I let you go, Marieke, I want to ask, as this is a book club episode and I love chatting books, if there's any books that you'd like to recommend. And especially, actually, as this is coming out on the 30th of October, this episode. So, do you have any particularly dark or spooky kind of book recommendations?
I mean, I think this book, I'm opened with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I feel like
Yes.
this is the sort of space you're interested in. I feel like that's a good one. Frankenstein is always a classic, I think. And
Yes.
a lot of those elements in this book as well. Yeah. But I mean, I guess as far as book recommendations, I'm also a trainee therapist. So I'd also really like to recommend a book called Gestalt therapy, which is the kind of therapy that I study. And I think sometimes there's just nothing freakier than the human mind.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's a good
100%.
one to read for Halloween as well, which is
Yeah, absolutely.
like
That's a
therapist
great one.
themselves. Yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you. So, for our listeners, this book is out now. A Scarab, Where the Heart Should Be, is out now, published by Dead Ink Books. And Marieke's first novel, Waiting for Ted, is also out now. So, go grab your copy of that also. Where can our listeners find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter, just my name, Marieke Bigg. I also have a website, mariekebigg.com. I think, I hope.
And you
So
also
yeah,
run
it's,
writing courses as well, don't you?
I run writing workshops, so you can find information about those on my website. And they're very much in the space of therapeutic writing. So if you're interested in sort of self-discovery through writing, that's another thing I
That
do.
sounds amazing.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, Marieke. It's been such a pleasure chatting to you today. And I really love this book. And I feel like it's the perfect kind of book for this time of year. It's
Yeah.
very dark, it's very strange, but I think there's also so much on complex characters and complex relationships. And the dynamics between these three people are so interesting to read. So I think that this book will appeal to a lot of people. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. So for the listeners, go grab your copy. As I've said, go give Marieke a follow. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. You can also find us over on Patreon. And that is all we've got time for. So thank you so much again, Marieke.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really fun talking to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, listeners, for listening. Bye.